Welcome to my talk about being a good corporate citizen in Kubernetes. First, I'll tell you a bit about me. I've spent more than 20 years working in the technology industry, and most of that time I've been working on open source projects from within a variety of different companies. I've been the director of community at Puppet and community lead for Intel's Open Source Technology Center. I also have a PhD from the University of Greenwich in London that I got by researching how people working at many different companies collaborate within the Linux kernel. Before the VMware acquisition of Pivotal, I was also responsible for driving Pivotal's Kubernetes contribution strategy, and I was actively contributing to Kubernetes within the Contributor Experience SIG. I'm now working in VMware's Open Source Program Office, and I'm responsible for our open source community strategy. So lately, I've been more active in the CNCF contributor strategy SIG, in particular the governance working group. I'm also a board member of Open UK, which is focused on developing and sustaining leadership in open technology here in the UK. I'm a governing board member and maintainer for the Linux Foundation's CHAOS project, which is focused on using metrics to evaluate the health of open source projects. I'm also on the advisory board for Bitergia, which is a company that builds open source health metrics dashboards. My work within open source software has focused on both growing participation in company-driven open source projects and in helping our employees collaborate within large foundation-driven projects, like the work that I've been doing within Kubernetes and other CNCF and ecosystem projects. Let's start by talking about how collaboration works within Kubernetes and these complex interactions between individuals, employers, and the communities. While I'm talking specifically about Kubernetes in this talk, much of this also applies to other open source projects. Your contributions to Kubernetes are centered around you as an individual. Contributions come from individuals rather than companies. When someone submits a pull request to fix a bug, add a feature, or update some documentation within Kubernetes, the change comes from an individual. Commits usually include a name and an email address, but in many cases, unless someone uses their corporate email address, you can't even tell where a person works. As individuals, there are plenty of opportunities to move into positions of leadership within the community. And these are all documented in more detail as links off of the community page on GitHub. But I wanted to provide a short overview to help people understand the community structure within Kubernetes. The starting point is here at the bottom as an org member after you've made a few contributions, and this allows people to assign you to issues and other activities in GitHub. After you have a history of making solid contributions and reviewing other people's contributions, you can be made a reviewer and eventually an approver. These roles are documented in owners files, which indicate the parts of the repository where you have those responsibilities. Most of the work within Kubernetes happens across the dozens of special interest groups and working groups, which I'll talk about later. And each of these can have multiple subprojects, and each of those subprojects also has leads assigned. And at the very top is the Kubernetes Steering Committee, which is an elected governing body with oversight over the entire project. To make all of this more interesting for employers, the leadership positions within Kubernetes stay with the individual if that person moves to a new company. And let's face it, Kubernetes skills are in high demand, so you see quite a bit of movement between employers. For example, within the past year or so, we've seen a couple of people on the steering committee, and many other leads change employers. Since an employee can take their leadership position in a project to the next job, companies are well served to make sure that they keep these contributors happy. In the Kubernetes project, as I mentioned, there is no direct way for companies to participate other than dedicating time from individual employees who contribute on behalf of the company, which is becoming increasingly common across many different kinds of open source projects. I work at VMware, and we have loads of people working full-time on Kubernetes. Similarly, companies like Red Hat, Google, Microsoft, Intel, and loads of others employ people to work on Kubernetes as their day job. If you don't already have employees with the skills to contribute to Kubernetes, you might be able to hire an existing contributor or possibly even a lead as an employee to do the work on the project on your behalf. In addition to devoting time from your employees to the project, the CNCF also relies on funding that comes from member companies to fund infrastructure, events, and other project needs. And I'll talk more about all of this later, since corporate involvement in Kubernetes is indeed the main focus for this particular presentation. The Kubernetes community is made up of a wide variety of individuals who are working together to make Kubernetes awesome. When I talk about community, I'm including all of the people who work on the project. This includes developers, release management, testing, localization, and anyone else who contributes to the project. Application developers who are using the Kubernetes APIs and other features to build things that will run on top of Kubernetes. Users, the people who run Kubernetes day to day in their environments and hopefully provide some feedback to the project along the way. People like me who are working for vendors and companies who create their products based on Kubernetes. Other contributors include people working on promotion, organizing meetups, doing documentation, and so many other sort of thankless tasks. And some of these people contribute as part of their day job on behalf of an employer, while others contribute in their free time. And they're all important parts of the community. In open source communities, I've also had so many small world moments where people that I've worked with in past projects pop up again and again in other communities that I'm a part of. When I first joined the Contributor Experience SIG meeting, I saw several people that I had known from previous communities. It's important to keep in mind that you are likely to run into these same individuals again and again. So be thoughtful and kind when working with others. If you're a big jerk in one community, it is likely that other people will remember this and bring your reputation with them into new projects, which can reflect badly on you and on your company. As an employer, it's worth doing a bit of due diligence to see how someone has behaved in other open source communities before you have them contribute to Kubernetes on your behalf. This individual, employer, and community triad creates unique challenges. As an individual contributing to Kubernetes or any other open source project, there will be times when you will need to find ways to create balance between what your employer wants you to do and doing the right thing for the Kubernetes community, which can create really awkward and uncomfortable conversations with your managers sometimes. The worst case scenario is when there are direct conflicts and what your employer wants you to do would go against the best interest of the Kubernetes community. At times like these, you'll need to be diplomatic. It can help to ask some questions to understand what your company needs to accomplish and see if you can find another creative way to meet this need in a way that aligns with the needs of the community. Sometimes this won't be possible, and you'll need to go back to your company and explain why what they want just isn't going to happen, which is one of those really awkward and uncomfortable discussions. As an employer, you can make this easier on your contributors by taking the time to understand the types of Kubernetes contributions that will be welcomed by the community. It's important to have regular conversations with your contributors to understand what the project needs and to learn how you can work within the community. You can help your employees be successful by being careful not to push your employees to do things that aren't in the best interest of the community. Personally, I've been in a couple of situations where I've left companies because of this conflict in other open source projects. And I know lots of really amazing people who've done the same thing. Kubernetes contributors are in high demand, so helping your employees avoid these conflicts in the first place will help you retain this great talent. Now that we have a better idea of how collaboration works in Kubernetes, next up we'll talk about how to build a Kubernetes contribution strategy and plan for your company. Before the VMware acquisition of Pivotal, I was responsible for creating our Kubernetes contribution strategy. One key to having a successful strategy for your open source contributions is to align them with the overall business goals for your entire company. If your open source contributions don't support the overall strategies for your organization, you will drastically reduce the chance of being successful. By taking some time and effort to make sure you support your overall corporate strategy, then it will be much easier to justify continuing these efforts during the next planning cycle for your organization. This is why I started by looking at Pivotal's corporate and product strategies. When writing Kubernetes contribution strategies, I made sure that I could show how our work on Kubernetes supported our overall goals as a company. This can really help make the case to senior management and company executives who are not likely to be involved in the low-level details of the project. Explaining how your Kubernetes contributions support the goals of the company can help the exec team understand the importance of this work. On the other hand, when your goals are not clearly aligned with the overall strategy, people will look at your participation in the Kubernetes community as something that can just be cut or starved of resources. With open source projects, it is so easy to fall into the trap of describing your contributions as something that can sound an awful lot like charity to an executive. There is a strong open source ethos of contributing to the common good of the project, or what people often refer to as chop wood and carry water tasks, and these are really important. We all need to pitch in and help in a variety of areas. But even many of these tasks can be described in ways that help your executives see why these tasks are also important. It's also a good idea to encourage employees to work on these activities when they're blocked on other tasks, like maybe waiting for pull request reviews. While some employees might see contributing to Kubernetes to be its own reward, having a solid strategy can also help employees understand how their work contributes to the success of the company. As an employee, it's really nice to see that your work has an impact in helping the company achieve their goals. Most of the work within Kubernetes happens within the dozens of special interest groups, working groups, and other committees. And as you can see from the slide, there are a lot of them. It can be overwhelming at first, and it's unlikely that you will be able to have employees contribute to all of these areas. So you want to focus on a few areas that are the most important for you based on what you're trying to achieve as a company. Determining where you need to contribute within these areas is likely to be the focus of your Kubernetes contribution strategy. At Pivotal, I spent a lot of time talking to product managers and engineering leadership to better understand both our current pain points and our future product strategies, so that I could understand both our short and long-term needs for the various Kubernetes technologies. For example, we had customers asking for Windows support, and we already had some people contributing within the Windows special interest group. So that was included in the strategy as something that we needed to continue doing to support our current needs. We also had some efforts underway to start shifting our applications to run on top of Kubernetes, so that over the longer term, we could just run everything on Kubernetes. To support this longer term strategy, we had people start working within SIG API machinery, since most of our product teams would eventually need to use the Kubernetes APIs. And these are just a couple of examples of where we decided to focus, but ultimately you need to figure out the best places for your employees to contribute. If you aren't sure where to start, contributor experience, docs, and release are all great SIGs that are both friendly to newcomers, and they help provide more insight into the overall project as you learn more about how Kubernetes really works. Since companies contribute to Kubernetes by having employees participate and collaborate, you'll need to figure out how many people you need and what skills are required for those people. In some cases, you might have employees with the skills you need. But this goes beyond just knowing the right technologies or having particular specialized skills. Contributing to any open source project, like Kubernetes, requires some different skills than participating in internal projects. These people need to be comfortable in really ambiguous environments where they will receive feedback, possibly difficult or negative feedback, and they'll be expected to respond to this feedback in the public in a professional manner. Likewise, they'll also be providing feedback to other community members. And keep in mind that not every engineer wants their work to be in the public spotlight, which can feel like being under a microscope sometimes. If you don't have the skills internally, you might be able to find existing Kubernetes contributors that you can hire. But you need to be just a little bit careful about this option too, because you don't want to get a reputation for aggressively poaching employees from other companies. It requires a bit of nuance to make it known that you're interested in hiring people to work on Kubernetes without aggressively hiring them away from other employers. Now that you've figured out what you want to do, let's talk about how to do it while being a good corporate citizen and avoid some common but embarrassing mistakes. The first step is to join a SIG or working group. Now, each SIG or working group is a little bit different, but this usually means joining one or more mailing lists and Slack channels. It's a good idea to always join the main mailing list for your SIG or working group so that you get project meeting invites and other important information. Then you should also join any relevant sub-project mailing lists or Slack channels that you're interested in. If your time zone permits, attending the SIG working group and sub-project meetings is a really great way to learn more about the current work, but the meetings are recorded so you can watch them later if you aren't able to attend. The monthly community meeting is another good meeting to attend or watch later to get an overview of what's happening across the entire project. You'll also want to have a close look at project documentation, especially the contribution docs. Spend whatever time it takes to fully understand the contribution guidelines, code of conduct, and other expectations for collaboration. The expectations for contributors are different for each project. So don't assume that you know how to contribute to Kubernetes, even if you have experience with other open source projects. Also note that most SIGs and working groups have their own contribution guidelines that cover anything specific to their area. So you want to have a look at those too. The good news is that Kubernetes has a ton of really amazing documentation and virtual workshops for new contributors, so it should be fairly easy to understand how to get started. I also recommend taking the time to lurk in your SIG or working group to understand how people participate. I have seen too many overeager new community members in various open source communities who jump into the community with both feet. They make mistakes by violating community norms, talking about things that aren't relevant, and just generally kind of making a mess of things. Everybody makes mistakes at some point, but some of them can be avoided by taking the time to learn about the community, rather than barging in and trying to be an active participant on day one. Don't be afraid to sit back while you learn from other community members. By taking the time to observe and lurk for a bit, you can learn about how people behave and get a feel for how people typically respond. When you've spent some time understanding the expectations and how to contribute, you should start with something small, like bug fixes, to learn about the contribution process. A good place to start is by looking at the issues for your SIG or working group and finding ones that are tagged Good First Issue. And after gaining some experience doing a couple of the Good First Issue issues, you can move on to an issue that you find interesting. Or you can look for issues tagged as Help Wanted, which are issues that often require a bit more experience than Good First Issues, but are also great places to get involved. Once you start participating, you should expect feedback. In some cases, you might need to have hard discussions with people about the merits of your contribution, but you can focus on the problem, deliver your feedback with a bit of kindness, and also avoid any attacks on the other person. For tough conversations, it can also help to have someone else read your response before you post it publicly to help catch any issues with tone that might make you sound more harsh than you think you do. This is an incredibly difficult line to walk sometimes, but staying professional And being kind to other people when responding to difficult feedback can make a big difference to your personal reputation and the reputation of your employer within the Kubernetes community. In many cases, especially when you're new to Kubernetes, you should expect to iterate on the feedback. After you submit your changes to accommodate the first wave of feedback, you're likely to get more feedback on the changes you just made. So just consider it an iterative process. This also means that you should plan for the time it takes to get multiple waves of feedback. Submitting something at the last minute before a release window closes and we do a code freeze, and then expecting it to be included is just going to be frustrating for everyone involved. So give yourself plenty of time for multiple feedback and resubmit processes. After you get past those first few small contributions, you'll want to make sure that you spend time discussing proposed changes in your SIG or working group before you start making them. These discussions usually happen in SIG or working group meetings or in GitHub issues. By talking about these contributions very early in the process, you can make sure that they will be consistent with the expectations of the project. You can also learn about anyone else who might be working in similar areas to hopefully avoid conflicting changes that won't work together once they're merged. These discussions also avoid surprising people, especially for new features or other really big changes. It can also help to break big changes into smaller, easier to digest contributions. It's a lot easier for maintainers to find time to provide feedback on smaller contributions. And it gives you time to make corrections if anything you're doing maybe isn't quite right. This allows you to iterate on the feedback through several contributions, making it less likely to have bigger fundamental issues with your contribution. It's also important to keep in mind that you don't really have any control over other participants in the project. This is different from working within a company where you can escalate any issues to managers who can work to resolve problems with non-responsive employees. In Kubernetes and other open source projects, you don't have a strict chain of command or other ways to exert control over the people you collaborate with. Instead, you should strive to be kind and easy to work with, since you may need to find other ways to influence people to respond to your pull requests or your patches. Community members, and especially leaders within the Kubernetes community, should expect to spend some time helping to bring up the next wave of new contributors. And as employers, we should plan to have our contributors put some effort into this. This could mean having employees who are experienced Kubernetes contributors mentor junior employees to help them get started in the community. Or it could mean participating in the many mentoring programs that are available within the Kubernetes community. Meet Our Contributors is a meeting where anyone can join to ask questions of experienced contributors. We also have shadow programs where a new person can shadow an experienced contributor for a specific role. This was first adopted within the release team, where each release has a leader for every role on the release team, and each of those leaders has a couple of shadows. When the new team is formed for the next release, the leads for each role are usually selected from the previous shadows. So this is a great way to move into a leadership position. While the shadow program started within the release team, it's also been expanding into other areas of the project. So you can find these shadow opportunities in different areas. Whenever you can, you should try to find opportunities to sponsor new contributors. Now, this term is a little bit confusing since a lot of people think of financial sponsorship, but in this case, it means using your position in the project to advocate for someone who might not otherwise have the same opportunities as you do. This can be as simple as recommending someone to help out with some part of the project, sponsoring someone for org membership, or maybe recommending someone as a new reviewer or approver. This is especially important for the underrepresented folks that might be overlooked or might not be as forthcoming about asking for a leadership role. A lot of the work that we do in Kubernetes and other open source projects is based on the relationships we have with other people. My PhD research was based on collaboration in the Linux kernel, And as part of that research, I interviewed a bunch of kernel developers. In all of the interviews, they talked about the importance of their relationships with other people. Almost all of them talked about how existing relationships made it easier to collaborate with others. All of the people that I interviewed mentioned in-person collaboration at conferences and other meetings as something that was important. People talked about how it was sometimes easier to work through really difficult, big issues at conferences. It's easier to communicate with someone online if you've met them before, and maybe shared a meal or a drink or just had a nice conversation with them. Knowing the human being on the other side of the keyboard can make a bigger difference than you might realize. Now, granted, this is a bit harder right now given the current pandemic and all, but we're making do with virtual events like this one and with video calls. If your employees are contributing to Kubernetes, then you should encourage them to attend KubeCon and Kubernetes contributor summits, even attending virtually. By having some key employees attend those conferences, they can build deeper, lasting relationships with others that will benefit your company and your other employees. I've spent a lot of time at open source conferences over the years, and I have really deep and lasting connections with people that I've met at those events. Now, when I need to do something new or have a question, I usually know someone who can point me in the right direction. And I often make introductions for other employees to people outside of the company who can help us learn something new or maybe just solve some tricky issue. Upstreaming your patches helps you become a good corporate citizen, but it also has quite a few internal benefits for your company. If you aren't familiar with upstreaming, this just means that when you make patches to fix a bug or solve some internal need, you submit those updates back into Kubernetes rather than continuing just to maintain them internally. When you maintain patches internally, every time we cut a Kubernetes release, you need to go through the work of reapplying your patches, and even possibly rewriting some of your patches if they touch bits of code that were changed in the release. The side effect of this sometimes difficult process is that people then tend to put off applying updates, which can be a big problem if the release contains security fixes. While it takes more time up front, you're better off taking the time to submit these patches into Kubernetes where they can be properly maintained as part of the project and where other people can benefit from them. The easier you can make it for your employees to contribute these changes back into Kubernetes and other open source projects, the better off you'll be. In general, upstream patches is considered the right thing to do in open source projects, which will help maintain your company's status as a good corporate citizen. The Kubernetes community is probably the friendliest and most welcoming community that I've ever been involved in, largely because of their community values. I'm going to wrap up this talk with a discussion of the Kubernetes community values because these values do a really good job of summing up my advice for being a good corporate citizen in Kubernetes. This slide has most of the community values, but the full list can be found online along with descriptions for each one. In Kubernetes, distribution is better than centralization. With a project as massive as Kubernetes, this scale is only viable through high trust and high visibility distribution of work. So authority, decision-making, technical design, code ownership, and documentation is delegated to the various special interest groups, working groups, and committees. This is why I recommend that you focus on particular SIGs and working groups when building your strategies and have each employee focus their energy on at most a couple of areas. Inclusive is better than exclusive within the Kubernetes community. Successful technology requires different perspectives and different skills, which are easier to achieve in a welcoming and respectful environment. Community membership in Kubernetes is a privilege, not a right, and leadership is earned through your contributions. We show respect for the time and effort put into a contribution, regardless of whether the contributor is brand new to the community or whether they're a veteran of the project. Your employees need to be prepared to engage with people in a way that's respectful. and kind while showing appreciation for the hard work of other contributors. In Kubernetes, evolution is better than stagnation. This not only refers to technological evolution, but also includes continual improvement, servant leadership, and mentorship. It's the duty for leaders in the community to find, sponsor, and promote new community members. Leaders should expect to eventually step aside. Community members should expect to step up. Your experienced employee contributors should expect to spend some time mentoring and/or sponsoring newer contributors. These can be other employees, interns, Google Summer of Code students, or anyone else looking for a new opportunity to participate. Kubernetes values community over product or company. So it's important for your employees to think of the needs of the community first, for the benefit of all its members and users everywhere. Individuals gain status through their work in the community, and companies gain status through their commitments to support this community by providing the contributors required for the project to operate. This goes back to when I was talking about that balance between individuals, companies, and the community. As an employer, it's in your best interest to make it easy for your employees to prioritize the needs of the community and not try to push your own agenda when it isn't in the best interest of the overall Kubernetes community. With that, I will say thank you and open it up for questions.